Hi everyone.
Hi.
Hello. Okay, so my name is Pamela Fox, and me and him were at a conference together a few weeks ago. I was talking about Backbone, and he was talking about sign-on.js and testing. And he thought maybe it'd be cool for me to come over here and talk to you guys, because I know you guys are thinking about using Backbone. So here I just thought I'd talk through just a brief introduction to Backbone and then the different ways that we use Backbone at Coursera, and then answer any questions you guys have about it. Sound good? Sweet. Okay, so first, so how many of you guys have actually used Backbone? Okay, cool, so not many, so that's good. So, you know, I think this is kind of obvious for you guys, but why should you use a framework? I went and counted through all the lines of JavaScript code we have, and it's 28,000, and that's for actually a really young app. I bet you guys have a lot more lines of code. I know that you have tons of tests. So you obviously have a lot of code, a lot of JavaScript files. The more you move stuff into the front end, you've got a lot of JavaScript files with a lot of logic in them and presentation. And you know, you have multiple people working on it, right? So with multiple people working on stuff, it helps to have a framework, it helps to have an architecture, and it helps to bring consistency across all your code so that I can go and jump into my colleague's code base and be like, oh, okay, he's using something very similar to what I'm using. For those of you guys who are JavaScript developers, you know that there's so many different ways of writing your JavaScript, right? And we're only just getting now to having kind of best practices around writing JavaScript. So I think it's even more important in JavaScript to decide on a common architecture and decide on a framework than in other languages, because there's so many different possibilities, and they don't work that well together, right? We decided to go with Backbone for now, mostly just to give our code structure, to be able to modularize stuff, to separate stuff, right? Like instead of having one giant JavaScript file, we can have the 250 JavaScript files, which sounds like a lot of files, but it's much better, you know, to have them all in separate files and to have them all in one. Much less likely to conflict when we're doing lots of changes. We also use Backbone for its persistence layer and common services like its routing and navigation. And also kind of the best practices and forces in terms of separating presentation from data. So here's just a brief intro to Backbone. It's an MVC framework. It was actually the first MVC framework I ever used. I know a lot of people come from like Rails and they're like, oh, Backbone is just like Rails. And it's like, cool. I haven't used Rails. So it was like, you know, before I liked having nice, pretty code before, but I just hadn't used anything that called itself an MVC framework. So the first time I ever tried to use Backbone, like it was kind of, I don't know, it was kind of blowing my mind. Like at one point I was so frustrated that I was like, crying in the bathroom, going, oh my god, this is insane, I don't understand how it wants me to structure my code. And thinking about Backbone, that it's lightweight, which means it doesn't have as many opinions as other frameworks. So I was sitting there trying to figure out how to structure my Backbone in a way that was Backbone-y, and I was asking for advice from other people who had used Backbone for a while, and they're like, well, you could do it this way, or you could do it that way. And I'm like, no, I just want to know the right way, right? I want to do it the most Backbone-y way possible. But Backbone is kind of lightweight, so it does have some right ways, but when it comes to applying them to whatever you guys are working on, you'll find that you're going to have to actually think and figure out how you want to apply it to your stuff. But anyway, so it is MVC, so we've got models and collections, and we often pass those into views, and the views will often render them into a template and create some DOM. And we have a router, optionally we have a router that will call up different views and passing the stuff in there. So here's a sample model. So let's say we're on a book, so we can just extend Backbone.model. We can specify defaults for the different properties of the book if we want, so that when we create a new one, it's got those defaults. We can do custom functions on it like display string, and we can do functions on it or methods on it like mark as owned. When we call that, it'll actually set the attribute of the book. So these models are basically just ways of adding more structure to our property bags, right? Like every object in JavaScript is just a bag of properties. But the advantage of actually wrapping them inside of Backbone is that you can listen to find out when something changes. So Backbone will tell you when an attribute has changed, and that can be really useful sometimes. You can do things like set, and you can choose to have it be silent or not silent, which is also very useful, right? Like whether you want people to be notified that an attribute has changed. So there's advantages to wrapping your property bags inside something like this. The other big thing here to note is the URL, and the URL specifies a URL on the server, and this is kind of a RESTful Backbone. If you use it this way, Backbone expects for that URL to represent a RESTful API for this model. So it would go to that URL to get that, but we'll see that more later. So if I want to create a new book, I just go and pass in whatever attributes I want to start it with. So then we have collections, because very often we have multiple models, and collections can be really simple. Just specify the model, and then once again specify the URL that corresponds to the REST API for that collection. So we could get the collection from the server, or we could also just create it. So we create a couple books, and then we create a book collection and pass in those models. And we also have, all over Backbone, we have events. So in the collection, we have events for finding out when stuff got added to the collection, finding out when the entire thing has been replaced, and stuff like that. So those events can be really useful. So now let's talk about the backend. You guys must have a RESTful API, right? Or some sort of API?
Sure.
Sure. Is it like RPC, REST? REST-ish? Okay, cool. Right. So Backbone lives in this nice world where it works perfectly when your API is very RESTful. Like, the way originally everything was supposed to be on the web, but didn't always work out. But going back to these URLs, so if I define that URL /API/books, then what I can do is I can create a new book object and pass in the ID of 12, and then call book.fetch. And then behind the scenes, Backbone will do an AJAX call to /API/books/12. It'll just create that URL. It expects the response to be JSON, and then it uses that, so it expects that response JSON to be, like the bag of the properties, and then uses that to fill in the model. So it has a lot of expectations, but if you fulfill those expectations, it works really well, because now you've got your book object filled in, and then you can do other stuff on it, right? So if I then called book.mark as owned, that would set owned to true, and I can call book.save, and book.save will then do an HTTP put to the URL, to sending the JSON, and that will then save the JSON. So it's pretty cool, yeah.
Is that all done synchronous?
No, it's using AJAX. So, right, that's a good question. So if you wanted to know when the book was actually fetched, you would listen to the changed event on that, and then once you got that event, you would know that it had come back and was filled in. And so the same thing with that. So in the docs, you'll see that they always mention what events they'll trigger at the end of the asynchronous call. And so you'll have functions that are listening to those events.
Instead of passing in a callback, you subscribe to events.
Yeah, you would say book.onChanged, update book display, right? So that's a very common thing to render your blank template, fetch your data. Once your data is in, it calls that function, which maybe re-renders your template, renders a new template, something like that. So just going on to collections. So once again, we've got that URL, and we can do the same thing, create a new book collection, fetch that collection, and that'll do a get just on that URL. Doesn't need any ID, get back an array of the JSON. If we wanted to actually add a new thing to the collection, if we did mybooks.create, it'll actually figure out, once again, that it wants to do a post, because this time it's creating a new thing. So it'll just do a post to API/books, specifying that JSON, and then it expects your server to respond back with that JSON, but filled in with other stuff as well, like the ID, right? So usually, it definitely expects a lot out of your server, and out of the way you do the RESTful communication, like having the ID field and stuff like that. But this is just the ideal way that Backbone expects, right? Very few people actually do it exactly this way. So Backbone gives you a lot of flexibility to specify a different ID, to specify a different function for parsing the JSON that comes back from the server, to specify a different way of syncing your models all entirely. So you really this is what you think of in your head as the way Backbone expects it, but you'll find people do it lots of different ways. And even in our code base, we do it 3 different ways. So I'll show that.
When you're fetching a collection, is it easy to specify parameters on that?
Oh, if you wanted query parameters to...
This seems sort of, like, normally you wouldn't just get like all of your users or whatever.
So it's an interesting question, because you would want to have a sort or a filter or something like that.
Yeah. Like something we do is like maybe want all the users in an enterprise, not all users.
Yeah. Oh, how have I done that? I have done that in one place. I can't remember if that was in the fetch or whether I had a function to figure out what that URL was supposed to be. So definitely possible. Can't remember the way I actually did it when I did it. Yeah. Cool. Okay, so that's their back end. So typically you're passing the models and collections into views. You don't have to. Some people actually use Backbone in combination with other things. Like if you've heard of Angular.js, apparently some people actually mix Backbone models with Angular.js because they like the kind of view style of Angular.js, but they like the modeling of Backbone. But most people would go and pass them into views, right? So here you have to extend Backbone view. You can specify a tag name for it, and that'll mean that everything you create in that view is stuffed inside a tag that's an LI. You could specify an element and it'll stuff it inside there, or you could specify nothing and then you decide what's going to happen ultimately. You can specify a template if you want, and then you have this render function, and that's what other people will call. And typically in the render function, you will pass your model, and you'll do this.model.toJSON, just turning it back into that property bag to pass to whatever templating library you're using. And here I'm just rendering it into the element of the view. So every view has a this.l, and that this.l encapsulates everything inside the view. So views are really nice for keeping everything scoped to a particular element so that you're making sure you're not reaching outside of your views and doing other stuff, right? And here you can see an example of the events we were talking about. So this is very typical. So we extend a view, and then we define the initialize function. So in initialize, we'll bind the reset event, which is called whenever a collection gets filled with data, and that'll call this.render, and then we fetch it. And so once it actually comes in and is fetched, render gets called. We iterate through each of the models in that collection, create a new one of those views, and then append the result of that view to this view. So this is an example of nested views, which is a common thing to do as well. Any questions on that? Cool. So then finally we have the router. And once again, this is something that's optional, but generally with the router what you do is define your list of routes, and then each of the routes just corresponds to a function by name. And sometimes in that function you might actually create the models there, then create the view, maybe pass in that model that you created, and then get back the result of rendering that view and put it into some part of your site, right? So maybe we stuff it into the sidebar of this site. And when you want to actually start the router, so if you create a new app router and do backbone.history.start, Backbone will basically look at the current URL, figure out which of the routes corresponds to the current URL, and then call that function. So if you were at /index and you called backbone.history.start, you probably get an error. It says, it can't find any routes. Now these routes, they work with the HTML5 history API. So this is in making the way Backbone lets you use it is that you can actually go from one route to the other without ever refreshing the page. So that's the style of using Backbone as a single page web app. You don't have to do that. You could have it just be that every time a page loads, it looks at this and just renders that route. But you definitely can have it so that every time you click from one link to the next, it's actually just going to be using all the Backbone routing behind the scenes, right? So there's a backbone.router.navigate, which will use HTML5 history to do stuff instead. So we kind of mix and match in our code.
Does that work with older browsers that don't?
So what it'll do in the older browsers is that it'll do the hash and the hash change event, and it'll do some polling for that. It does kind of work, right? It's a little uglier because you'll see, like, if you go to Coursera and like IE8, you'll see Coursera/pound courses. And the awkward thing about that is that then that means you can't really use hash inside your page, right? Because you're using hash for the Backbone stuff. So that gets a little bit weird. So we can't actually, like, in our terms of use, we can't have hash, we can't use anchors to link to the different parts of it properly. We actually have to write some JavaScript to handle that case. So yeah, it can fall back to that stuff. We do use the fallback, but it's not the optimal user experience, and it adds some complexity to your code. Cool, so just some notes on the Backbone working with other things. So Backbone is actually kind of built to work well with jQuery, right? So here's their standard jQuery. In Backbone, as I was saying, every view has this.l. It also has this.$l, which is just a jQuery equivalent of this.l. So you're encouraged to always use this.l for doing all of your operations. You could still use the global dollar if you had jQuery available to you, but that would mean you're looking inside your whole document, and you could be adding stuff to your whole document. If you just keep it scoped to this.l, then you make sure that all the DOM manipulation you're doing stays inside that view, right? So that's pretty cool. That's pretty convenient. Backbone is also built on underscore. Both the libraries are by the same guys, the Document Cloud people. And underscore is a bunch of utility functions. Do you guys use underscore? No? Okay. Do you use like the ES5 shim? What do you use for functions? Okay. Well, so underscore is very much like data-oriented functions, right? So we have functions on collections, on arrays, and also functions on functions. It's just stuff that really should have been part of JavaScript from the beginning, right? So stuff like a for each. There's .each, find, filter, map, reduce, flatten, pluck, where. I don't have them all memorized, but there's quite a few. And interestingly, a lot of these actually are implemented in ECMAScript 5 now. So if you look at ECMAScript 5, like on Mozilla Developer Network, you'll see like array.forEach and array.filter and all that stuff. So when those actually exist, it'll fall back to them. So eventually, maybe we don't need underscore because everything's in JavaScript. But it's just a bunch of really handy functions. It's built to work well with Backbone. So what you can actually do is on any Backbone collection, you can just call any of their collection functions, right? So Backbone collection.each, Backbone collection.find, .filter, .map, etc. This is cool. The weird thing though is that it returns back an array, not a Backbone collection, which I found really surprising. So you actually would have to turn that array back into a Backbone.collection if that's the way you want to work on it. You can just do like new Backbone collection and give it the array, or new book collection and give it the array. So that's a little weird. So I've actually kind of stopped using those because I don't like the way that works. Everything on Backbone and underscore goes through that guy, Jeremy Ashkenas, and he seems to think that this is good, so whatever. Backbone also works pretty well with Require.js. You got anyone using that? So Require.js is a nice way of managing your JavaScript dependencies, right? So when you have all the JavaScript all over the place and you want to say like, well, this JavaScript needs this JavaScript in order to operate, traditionally we would do that just by making sure that we had the right script tags on the page. But that's shitty, right? And that's bad because you'll always forget to update stuff. And it's also bad because you don't want to have multiple script tags on the page. You want to have things concatenated all together. Like ideally, every page just loads one CSS and one JavaScript file, right? So Require.js makes it easy to say, all right, here's my JavaScript, and here's everything it depends upon. So when you're in like development mode and you have this, it will make sure that these are loaded before it calls this, right? And then when you're in production mode, what we do is we run r.js, and r.js will go through and make an optimized bundle for our front page. So basically we have like our main function, our routes file, and our routes file has a bunch of defines in it. And that's kind of everything that we need for the front page, as well as a few things that we want to have included because users typically will go from the front page to this next page, right? So that's we make the optimized bundle using r.js, and that becomes the JavaScript that we serve. And if somebody goes to a page after that and the JavaScript isn't there, then we'll just we'll just load it on demand, right? So it does mean that on some pages they may get a few extra loads. But for the most part, it's optimized. I think some people have worked on making it so that even on the other pages, they'll still get like a concatenated thing for the other pages, but that's tricky. So this is just something that it's a very common thing to use together, but don't have to. Okay, so now more specifics on how we use Backbone at Coursera. So first we have some Backbone customizations that we've done across the board. So we use Backbone in 3 different places, so kind of 3 different front ends that are separate code bases, but we try and share some common code across them. So these are some of the things we have across everything. So one is we have a custom router. And that router does a few things, like it tracks when there's errors and logs errors and tracks page views. It has some cross-browser stuff in it. But nothing too fancy. We also have a custom region manager. And the point of the region manager is like, so we have our Backbone page, and maybe it's got this view and this view and this view. And when somebody clicks on the next one, by default Backbone would just re-render all those views. But what we want is to say, all right, well, the header's not changing, so let's just keep the header here and only swap in the body, right? So our region manager is a way where we can say, okay, this particular route is only going to swap in the body, and everything else will stay the same. And it can also do stuff like animations and weird things like that. But from what I can figure out, pretty much everybody uses Backbone has either written their own custom region manager or is using a library that does it. So if you start using Backbone, you may find yourself very quickly wondering, why aren't there regions in Backbone? So we wrote our own, but there's also popular ones out there like Marionette, which do stuff like this for you. And we also have a custom API layer. And this API layer wraps over the Backbone API layer, and we're kind of over or under, and it does a few things. It takes care of like messages that we throw up to let people know that an AJAX request is happening, right? So that we don't have to do that custom for everyone. It also takes care of our CSRF token stuff, because that was something we wanted common across all of them. We made the mistake one day, so our stack is on Django, and for some reason we had CSRF middleware disabled, so none of our things were getting checked for CSRF. And then one day we're like, oh shoot, let's just go turn it back on. So we turned it back on, but then we realized we weren't doing our CSRF properly everywhere on the site. So some of the requests from users ended up failing because the CSRF wasn't done properly. So that's when we realized that we really needed this common API layer across everything, so that stuff like CSRF didn't get done multiple times and then didn't get accidentally left out. So those are across everything. Yeah.
Underneath model save.
Yeah, I think what we're doing with the API layer is, so we call Coursera API.post, and so in every Backbone model you'll say like what API you're using. That's how we do it, and then we'll call model.save. Yeah. So as long as you do Coursera API.post, that does all the Backbone stuff behind the scenes. And Backbone also wraps jQuery, so you have like kind of these layers of stuff. Every time you have layers of stuff, it's kind of can get crazy sometimes. But the Backbone code is actually fairly comprehensible. I've been inside some MVC framework codes where I'm like, oh my god, this is crazy. But Backbone code is pretty followable. I've had to follow. Debug inside it before, and it wasn't the worst thing in my life, so it's an accomplishment.